What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we got a good one for you guys. My personal favorite video to make each and every week. This is the wide receiver trade targets video. That's right, our buy low, sell high wide receivers heading into week 6. With us being 6 weeks into the season, we can't of course expect to get everybody at super cheap prices like we could at the earlier portion of the season. But regardless, that doesn't mean we need to pay full price, so making sure that we're targeting the right players is the only way we can truly enter trades, knowing we're going to be getting a good value. In today's video, we'll be going over several players that if you target them this week, you're likely going to be paying less than their rest of season value. Then round out the video with some players we think you should trade away before their value completely tanks. Before we do get into the video though, we have to go over our stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running back has somehow fumbled 4 different times but hasn't lost a single one of them. The correct answer was actually Devin Singletary. Congratulations to Big Blue Quad X, the first to get this right on YouTube, and as for Twitter, Colin Grace 15. Once again, congratulations to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, only counting tight ends and wide receivers, which player with at least 25 receptions currently boasts the league's best catch rate. Once again, only counting wide receivers or tight ends, but which player currently boasts the league's best catch rate, they must have a minimum of at least 25 receptions. If you know who that player is, leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Alright guys, now without further ado, let's hop right into those buy low wide receivers. This is everybody's favorite part of the video. And just a quick message to all of you out there, and more of a reminder, but when you're going to be sending out offers to different opponents in your league, the best course of action is going to be taking a look at their roster, identifying which area and which position they're weakest in, even using upcoming bye weeks as a tool to help you get a deal done. I can't tell you how often I'm seeing people send out trade offers to their opponents that really don't make sense for their opponent to even accept, oftentimes beginning their trade offer with players of excess on their team rather than looking at their opponent's roster, identifying their areas of weakness. If you're able to break that bad habit and put yourself in your opponent's shoes, I promise you're going to have a much higher success rate in getting trades done. Your opponents will take your offers much more seriously. Not only will you be saving your league mates a ton of time each week, but you'll also save yourself a ton of time as well. So if you do find yourself guilty of this, maybe try taking a different approach this week. But with that, let's hop over to our first wide receiver, which is Diontae Johnson of the Pittsburgh Steelers. When it comes to Diontae Johnson, you could also include Chase Claypool if you're looking for more of a bargain bin player to also include in the buy low section. The main reason as to why we're targeting these Pittsburgh Steelers receivers is because Juju Smith-Schuster, he is going to be out for the remainder of the season. While it's very true that Juju Smith-Schuster as an individual contributor may not have been the best for fantasy football, the fact of the matter is that he was garnering a pretty sizable target market share in this Pittsburgh Steelers offense. He had 2 games where he received 8 targets, another contest in which he received 7, and with his target market share now up for grabs by both Diontae Johnson and Chase Claypool, it will increase the floor for both players. Diontae Johnson, a player with already a safe floor, so for him, more importantly, it will increase his ceiling. Chase Claypool, though, as mentioned, we could include him on this list. One thing I do want you to keep in mind is if investing in him, he is coming off of his best game, but fantasy owners of Chase Claypool are likely going to be looking at him as selling high. Yes, he did post 24 fantasy points, but against the Denver Broncos in week 5, he only received a whopping 6 targets. That was his second lowest total of the season, his lowest since week 1. And with this being his first game of the entire season in which he actually reached pay dirt, many owners of Chase Claypool may be looking at him as a player to sell high this week. And if there's any chance that you're able to get Chase Claypool for any sort of flex value in return, to me, I think you're getting an absolute steal. And as for Diontae Johnson, this is a player you're actually technically buying low on. His week 5 outing was the second lowest fantasy points that he was able to put together all season since week 1. In addition to that, he saw his lowest targets of the season coming in with just 2. In every other game that he started, he'd seen double digits. And as mentioned, with Juju Smith-Schuster out now, Diontae Johnson is a virtual lock for double-digit targets in nearly every other game for the remainder of the season, so long as he's healthy. And as for the price tag for what we're trying to get Diontae Johnson for, I say if you're able to leave a trade paying high-end wide receiver to value and leaving the trade with Diontae Johnson, well, I think when you look back on the trade several weeks from now, you'll be very happy that you pulled the trigger for that price. Moving into the next wide receiver buy low we have, this is going to be another player similarly to Chase Claypool that you're not necessarily buying low on. This is going to be Kadarius Toney. However, just because he's coming off of his best game doesn't mean you're not necessarily buying low on what his rest of season value will be if you try to target him in a trade this week. And the reason I say that is because many players just got him off the waiver wire 1 or possibly 2 weeks ago. And in a similar case like we do have with Chase Claypool, many fantasy owners believe they will be selling high on him as a player they just got off the waiver wire, potentially trading him for an upside flex type receiver, maybe somebody more proven, just because Kadarius Toney's production is all but guaranteed at this point, at least in their mind. And with the New York Giants receivers getting healthier each week, his role and involvement in the offense could presumably be at its highest point, when in reality we do value him as a top 35 wide receiver for virtually the rest of the way. If you actually look at the rest of season rankings we do have on our website, he's actually listed as the wide receiver 33. So if you're able to land Kadarius Toney for any player in the flex type range, you're going to be leaving with an absolute steal in our mind. And as mentioned, since many players did get him off the waiver wire recently, many fantasy owners are going to be willing to flip him for a proven producer. Overall, that's why we do feel you'll be buying low on him, even though he is coming off of his best game. But if you're looking for more of a prototypical buy low player, look no further than this next player, Terry McLaurin of the Washington football team. As mentioned, this is a prototypical buy low player because Terry McLaurin not only posted a dud for fantasy owners, but he posted his worst fantasy performance of the entire season, his first single-digit fantasy performance in full PPR leagues. Obviously, the best time to target players in trades is going to be when they're coming off of poor performances, and with Terry McLaurin posting his worst of the season, this would be your best time to try and go after him. As for where we do value him for the remainder of the season, we have him currently ranked in the rest of season rankings as the wide receiver 13. So when comparing him to other players like Marquise Brown, Antonio Brown, even Chris Godwin, players that have been producing for us all season long as well, we do have them ranked below him in the rest of season rankings. So in a 1-for-1 trade, we would fully support that deal. As for Terry McLaurin, while we understand just because of one bad game his value is not going to completely tank, it's still going to be a completely different conversation when you approach a trade partner with him coming off of a single-digit fantasy performance, as opposed to if you were coming off of a 20 or 30 point game. And with his next two matchups being against the Kansas City Chiefs and Green Bay Packers, two teams that you know offensively are going to be pushing the Washington football team to have to be passing the ball late and passing the ball often. So Terry McLaurin, a player who received 11 targets in this past dud game where he scored 8 fantasy points, so the odds of him putting in a worse performance in those two matchups is just completely unlikely. So targeting him this week is going to be in your best interest, and as mentioned, if you're able to get him for any sort of high-end wide receiver 2 value or string together a couple players, ultimately totaling similar value to a high-end wide receiver 2, then we think when you look back on this trade in a few weeks, you're going to be more than happy with the deal that you got. Alright guys, if you're looking for a high-end wide receiver that's going to be coming in at virtually next to nothing when it comes to price tag, look no further than this next wide receiver. It's AJ Brown of the Tennessee Titans. I know right now AJ Brown's name doesn't have a bunch of glamour surrounding it. Currently, he's ranked as the wide receiver 77 in both PPR and standard, so anybody that drafted him as a back-end wide receiver 1, it's safe to say they're regretting that decision. What is promising is to know that in his last matchup, he did play on 64% of the snaps, and with AJ Brown being a player that can produce a lot of fantasy points with a very minimal amount of targets, even though he did only play on 64% of the snaps, see 6 targets in the game against Jacksonville, him putting up 6.8 fantasy points was still on the low end of production we would expect with that type of target market share and snap share. And what that means is the fantasy owner of AJ Brown is yet again going to be frustrated with the output he's produced for their team. The way we should be looking at it though is this is going to be one more week, potentially the final week, that we can buy low on AJ Brown. And with him falling short in a juicy matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, a divisional opponent that he routinely torches, fantasy owners are likely at their wits' end and would be willing to start many of their bench players just to avoid a potential dud. It's safe to say that AJ Brown single-handedly has handed many teams losses in games they would otherwise win. So when you're sending out offers to those owners, try to send out some of your safer players that are producing consistently at the wide receiver position. We would suggest sending maybe a mid to back-end wide receiver 2 when it comes to value. Just keep in mind though, if you are trading for AJ Brown, your team should be in a position where you can endure a loss or two. It's very possible that AJ Brown does sustain more injuries throughout the season, so a team that's potentially sitting at 0-5 or 1-4, AJ Brown at your wide receiver position is likely not going to be the solution, but teams that are sitting at 4-1, even 5-0 undefeated, your mind should be focused mainly on the playoffs and bringing your strongest fantasy team into the playoffs as possible. So enduring a couple bust games for your wide receiver 2 within the next 5 or 6 weeks is ultimately not going to derail you from your goal of making it to the fantasy playoffs and bringing your strongest roster. AJ Brown, of course, being a part of that that potential roster. And as mentioned, if you're able to trade for him for any sort of top 24 player, we currently have him ranked as the wide receiver 19 in our rest of season rankings. And don't get it mistaken, if he's able to come back healthy and string together a couple good performances, he will certainly rise up the rest of season rankings. But with us having him ranked as the wide receiver 19, that should indicate to you not to overpay for him, not to overpay for production that's not guaranteed. And when it comes to AJ Brown, this is going to be a risky trade, but one that certainly has the upside to pay off in the long term. Moving into the next buy low wide receiver we have, it's a familiar name. It's Michael Thomas of the New Orleans Saints. As it stands today, we currently don't know exactly when Michael Thomas will be returning, but one thing we know for sure is that it's not going to be this week. Currently, the New Orleans Saints have a bye week, but if Michael Thomas is able to return in any of the next 4 games following this bye week, he's going to have a phenomenal matchup. In week 7, the New Orleans Saints face the Seattle Seahawks, followed by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, then the Atlanta Falcons, and in week 10, they have the Tennessee Titans, and then to round out for the 5 weeks following the bye week, they have a matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles. For a wide receiver, these next 5 weeks are as juicy as they possibly could be for a matchup, so we fully expect as soon as Michael Thomas returns, presumably healthy, he's going to be a dominating force for fantasy football. One thing to keep in mind though is that this is a lower volume passing offense than we're used to seeing when it comes to Michael Thomas and the production we get from him, so expecting the days of him having double-digit receptions in back-to-back games, those games are long gone. But the success that we're seeing out of Marquez Callaway makes me more and more confident in investing in Michael Thomas. Callaway posting over 24 fantasy points last week against the Washington football team. In week 3 against the New England Patriots, we cannot forget he posted 14 fantasy points, and it's safe to assume that once Michael Thomas does return to this offense, he's going to regain his spot atop the depth chart at the wide receiver position. So that positive outing against the Washington football team, had Michael Thomas been in the lineup, many of those fantasy points would have then gone to him. And with the team having phenomenal matchups in the 5 weeks following his bye week, Michael Thomas, if he's able to return in any week soon thereafter, it's very likely that as soon as he returns to the lineup, he's going to be a producer you can trust in your fantasy lineup. Regardless though, we can't beat around the bush and act like you aren't going to be gaining some sort of risk when it comes to trading for Michael Thomas. So for that, we can't stress enough on the fact that you do need to be buying low on him. So if the owner of Michael Thomas is asking for a wide receiver 1 price tag or even a consistent wide receiver 2 in return, in that case, you may as well let the trade go. But if you're able to get him for back-end wide receiver 2 price, or maybe a consistent top 30 wide receiver, potentially in a trade that involves a team that desperately needs a win now, that's going to be your best bet in not only getting a deal done, but making sure you're not overpaying in the process. If you're looking for a player that's more bargain bin, somebody that you can get for a flex level player or potentially a bench player, but could potentially crack your starting lineup, then this final buy low wide receiver is certainly the player you're looking for. It's Jaylen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. Now when it comes to Jaylen Waddle, he's now put together a combined 11.6 fantasy points in a PPR league in back-to-back matchups. These were 2 positive passing matchups against the Indianapolis Colts and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, one of the main reasons we're suggesting buying into him at this point is largely because Tua is expected to be the starter against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Yet again, another positive passing matchup. And as we know, the passing offense and offense as a whole under Tua was moving much more efficiently with Tua than it has been under Jacoby Brissett. And with Tua's injury being a rib injury, something that causes him more pain than is actually debilitating when it comes to his actual skill on the field, we are fully expecting him to return to the field and return to form. So when it comes to Jaylen Waddle as an individual contributor and his potential fantasy upside from this point forward, his situation as a whole is looking up, so investing into him is going to be a player that you can get for next to nothing. Once again, this is a player who's had a combined 64 receiving yards in the past 2 games. If you're able to get him for any sort of bench player, specifically one that you don't think could potentially crack your starting lineup from this point forward, then we suggest trading some of your excess depth and targeting the upside of Jaylen Waddle, because to be frank, you have nothing to lose. Alright guys, now with that being said, it's time to get over to our sell high wide receivers, and we really don't have many on this list. These are of course going to be players that we're not buying into their rest of season value. They may be coming off of a really strong performance, or maybe their situation just looks very dismal from this point forward. And to start this list, we have Odell Beckham Jr. of the Cleveland Browns. Now, when it comes to OBJ, this is going to be one of those cases where you're not necessarily selling high on him. Yes, he is coming off of a 4-point fantasy day against the LA Chargers, but keep in mind the main reason we're selling Odell Beckham Jr. as fast as we possibly can, preferably this week, is because we can't guarantee that his role in the passing offense is even going to expand from this point forward. With Jarvis Landry being on IR, he's in the prime position to potentially succeed, but despite him being healthy and actually playing in a valuable amount of snaps, he's being outproduced by Rashard Higgins, a wide receiver with questionable talent. And with this offense overall leaning more towards the run game, us seeing production out of even the tight ends, including David Njoku, our expectations for Odell Beckham from this point forward are at their lowest point possible. Now factor in that Jarvis Landry will be returning at some point in the near future, and before the news that he is returning next week comes, trading away Odell Beckham while he is presumably the top receiver in this offense, that's going to be your best bet, and this may be one of the final weeks you have a chance to. Moving into the next wide receiver sell high we have, this is a player who's listed on the thumbnail. It's Robert Woods of the LA Rams. Now I get it, many owners of Robert Woods are now happy with the production they've received from him in back-to-back games. 14.8 PPR points in week 4, followed that up in week 5 with a massive volume day, 14 targets, 12 receptions, 150 receiving yards, even outpacing his counterpart Cooper Kupp, a receiver who's been a complete stud all season. But for those of you Robert Woods owners, I'm here to remind you that just 3 weeks ago, you could not trade Robert Woods to save your life. Now Robert Woods has produced in back-to-back weeks, 1 week getting bailed out by a touchdown, a 6-target game, and yes, he did follow that up with a 14-target game, a massive volume total, but that's going to be your key and your ticket to being able to sell him to your opponent. Let those that haven't owned Robert Woods buy into that one game's production, while simultaneously giving you a reasonable out, being able to even trade him at this point for players of reasonable value. And one thing I can guarantee you is that if he busts next week against the New York Giants and he's still on your roster, your ability to trade him will have gone right out the window. The next sell high wide receiver we have is one we can gloss over. It's Marquez Callaway of the New Orleans Saints. Clearly, this sell high candidate goes hand in hand with our play to target Michael Thomas. When MT does return, the volume and target market share for Marquez Callaway is likely going to diminish. And Marquez Callaway not only coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season, but now scoring 3 touchdowns in his past 3 contests, putting up starter level production in 2 of 3 contests as well. This is going to be your opportunity to liquidate him for anything possible, because we all know as soon as MT returns, you won't be able to get a penny for him. As for the price we're looking to get in exchange for Marquez Callaway, I would be willing to trade him for any sort of flex type receiver that has upside to potentially crack your starting lineup in the future. A player like Darnell Mooney, maybe the injured Sterling Shepard. These are all players that may not be putting up production right now, but could certainly be in your lineup and starting for you in the fantasy playoffs. And the final sell high player we have is Emmanuel Sanders of the Buffalo Bills. And don't get me wrong, we've been very high on Emmanuel Sanders since the pre-draft research process, but with him now coming off of another 20-point fantasy day, his second in the past 3 games, him now having a multi-touchdown game in 2 of the past 3 games as well, considering this is a player who's seen a max of 6 targets in every game since week 1, the chances of him continuing this type of production is just very unlikely. In fact, believe it or not, currently Emmanuel Sanders stands as the wide receiver 18 in PPR leagues, the wide receiver 14 in standard. So if you're able to get anything near that type of value in exchange for him, we definitely pull the trigger. As for a more reasonable price tag, we would say if you're able to get any sort of consistent top 35 wide receiver, a receiver potentially the 1 in their offense or high end 2 in their offense, those are going to be the types of players that we would like to flip Emmanuel Sanders for. One thing we do have to make clear though is this is still a player who has earned his spot in the top 20 wide receivers in PPR, top 15 in standard, so don't give him up for free, but make sure when you're getting a player you see a brighter future for them, because Emmanuel Sanders, while he's unlikely to remain as productive as he has been recently, he's still going to be a player that holds his value as long as he's healthy in this offense. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hoped you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching. Catch you on the next one.